Right, I'm with Alan Collins again in your, I don't know how many years has it been going on? 12, dozen years, at least a dozen years?
A good dozen years, I should think, yeah.
Still aspects of the same problem. Now, Alan, for those who haven't watched the previous interview, Alan Collins is the UK lawyer who's been dealing with child abuse cases and related matters for years and years and years, and is still doing so. Are there still live cases coming up? Are there
Well, what I'm looking at the moment, having been requested to do so, is the question whether Jersey is complying with its obligations, international obligations, to ensure that victims of crime, and in particular victims of sexual crime, are compensated. So I'm involved in a series of cases where victims of child abuse have been told that they can apply for compensation following convictions of their abusers, but they have been unsuccessful.
On what sort of grounds? Because they couldn't prove their case, or they...
Well, the cases have been proved because their abusers have been successfully prosecuted, which is, a considerable achievement, and one must recognise, what the police and the prosecution do to secure those convictions. But behind all of that, there's a requirement that victims of crime should be entitled to seek compensation if they want that. Some victims and survivors don't, other victims and survivors do. So, it's a matter of individual choice. So, we've been aware for some years now, because these cases have been raised by victims with government politicians, but there's a problem that they have not been able to secure the compensation that they thought they were entitled to. So what happens quite often, it seems, is that after the case is over, the police will say you're entitled to apply for compensation.
Right.
So victims and survivors naturally rely on that advice, follow it through, only to be told, actually, you're not entitled. And that begs the question, why are they not entitled?
And why are the police saying it? Why are the police
I suspect that the police, like lots of other people, think you are entitled.
Right.
So I suspect the police generally think these people are entitled. But actually, when you get down to the nitty-gritty...
Out of time, that sort of thing?
Yeah, there's all sorts of issues which derive from the nature of the crime, which is very unfair, because we know that children who are abused, by and large, delay in reporting.
Right.
And they delay in reporting for all sorts of reasons, but there are common threads. Guilt, the victim often feels that they are somehow responsible. Of course they're not, but that's the effect of the abuse. There's manipulation, there's often grooming, victims are made to feel responsible in some way, and of course they're not. They're victims, they were children, they were young people, entirely innocent, but the effect of the abuse makes them feel like that. There's lots of reasons that disempower a victim from coming forward in a timely fashion, and it's only later in life that perhaps they feel confident enough to come forward and make a complaint to the police. And that's been recognised time and time again by the courts, by the judges, by very august bodies such as the Royal Commission in Australia. We all know, the professional understanding is that a child or a young person who is sexually abused will delay in coming forward. And there are many barriers that prevent a child or young person getting
Is this
forward.
compensation you're talking about that will come from the state or from the perpetrator?
Well,
or both, maybe?
Well, Jersey has this law on prescription, which is 3 years, and it's very difficult to, as I understand it, I'm not a Jersey lawyer, I'm a UK lawyer, of course, but my understanding is that, the law of prescription basically says if you don't bring your claim before the court within 3 years, you're too late. So that's a real deterrent, a real problem. Jersey has, much like the UK, a law that says when the offender is sentenced, a compensation order should be looked at so that the offender pays compensation. That doesn't seem to happen for reasons I don't understand. I have to confess here, I don't understand why the court doesn't say when sentencing the offender, you've got to pay your victim some compensation. Then you have, just like in the UK, a criminal injuries compensation scheme, which is financed by the state, and that itself does not appear to be working for this particular group of victims. So this creates some really profound questions, because whether it's Jersey or anywhere else, if you're signatory to the European Convention on Human Rights, there's an argument that you've got to have this scheme in place to compensate victims of crime, and if it's not delivering on that, then the question is why not, and is this not a breach of your obligation under human rights legislation to ensure that you do have a scheme that...
It's strictly Convention of Human Rights stuff. It's not Convention on Rights of the Child. It doesn't feature in that, as far as you know.
Well, that's all part of the general background.
Right.
These conventions mean something. They're not just words. Otherwise, that's pointless. But what I'm interested in, and what has been raised with me, is this question: are the victims' rights under the European Convention of Human Rights being breached?
I'm reminded immediately you talk about this because in the case of Family X, it was when there was talks of millions of pounds of compensation, the Attorney General leapt into the case halfway through and created a new law about damages limitation. Now, I don't suppose that's having an effect, is it? Because they were worried about the extent of damages.
I don't know. That's beyond my remit. What I'm looking at is, or because I've been asked to look at it, is this question: why is it that these victims of serious crime not entitled to be compensated?
Of course, the time limit element was dealt with to an extent under the initial inquiry. That was dealt with, wasn't it? There was given a sort of an amnesty on that the time limit didn't apply for bringing complaints in the original Francis Oldham inquiry.
Well, mustn't get things confused. The problem is that I think if you looked at the work of the Australian Royal Commission, they make a very powerful argument as to why there should not be time limits for people sexually abused as children, for all the reasons that we know about. England and Wales still has the 3-year time limit, but a judge has a discretion to disapply it, provided it's fair to do so. Scotland, which has its own legal jurisdiction, always has done. The Act of Union allowed that. They had the same sort of 3-year limitation period, but they amended the law a couple of years ago to disapply it for sexual abuse cases, which mirrors what they've done in various Australian states. So in the wake of the Royal Commission in Australia, and its very sharp criticisms of these limitation laws, a number of the Australian states amended their law as well to basically get rid of this 3-year requirement.
Right.
So conventional thinking, or liberal thinking if you prefer, or realistic thinking, or fair thinking, or just thinking, says that you should, in Jersey, not have this 3-year period for victims of sexual abuse. But I'm the outsider, of course. I'm expressing an opinion. There'll be others who say, "Oh no, we've got to keep it." But I think it's in this day and age, it's an unnecessary barrier, because courts always have this ability to say that this, it's not appropriate to try this case for whatever reason, and it's unfair for whatever reason, whatever, and they can chuck the case out. So you don't really need, in my humble opinion, to have this 3-year prescription law anyway.
Of course, there's a very interesting royal case which is likely to hit the streets soon, because that's been rumbling on, and no doubt defences about time limitations will be one of the aspects.
Again, I'm not an expert on New York law, but my understanding is there was this window that in New York that was created for these time-barred cases to be brought to the fore. Maybe that's one of the reasons why the case was brought in New York. I don't know. I'm just venturing an observation.
Do you get any feedback at all, because you're a UK lawyer in the Lion's Den here, operating amongst the... Do you get any feedback at all from Jersey lawyers, what they think about such things? Do they discuss it? Have they got anything on the agenda?
I don't know. I just,
They never ask you to your opinion?
I don't suppose my opinion would matter very much, but you've asked me some questions about sort of why I'm here and what I'm being asked, and that's what I'm looking at.
Previously,
it's very interesting. It's very very interesting, and I can understand why the victims, survivors, are very determined to get things put right, because it is. I can see why they say it is very unfair, it's very unjust.
Right.
Had they been robbed in the street and injured, arguably they would be treated differently.
When you're talking here about abuse of children, it has to be sexual abuse, violence against children. Does that count as well?
It could do, yeah.
Right, because previously we were talking that you were mostly because the main inquiry was gone, the cases have been dealt with, but there were other cases arising from detention, people being arbitrarily detained, and you were looking at some cases then. Now, would detention fit into this sort of category? The people who've been detained, could they be claiming compensation under this if there are time limits?
Depends what they were complaining about and what had happened to them, of course. As far as I'm aware, you've had 2 compensation schemes, but they were designed for sort of very specific circumstances. What I'm talking about are people who were not necessarily involved in the care system, but terrible things had happened to them as children. They'd gone through the criminal process, been told that this was there for them, and they've gone to it and found that actually it isn't there for them, and that does seem to be unfair, particularly if they've been the victim of maybe another sort of crime when they possibly would have been entitled to it. I can understand why they are saying that it's all very unjust, it's unfair, and they are sort of being discriminated against simply because of the nature of the offence that they were the victim of, being sexually abused as children.
I mean, you've been at this, it's not a game, this activity, child abuse, sex abuse, those sort of cases for a very long time, not just in Jersey. You have got some degree of expertise on the matter. I'm amazed that you're not consulted. You're here now, you're in Jersey. I'm amazed that the politicians don't say, "Oh, Alan Collins, come and speak to us about this." Is that what, do they do that? Do they ever ask you?
No, by and large, no. But again, it's trying to be objective about it. I'd be a useless politician, wouldn't I? Because, I'd focus on a particular problem because people come to me with a particular problem, asking for a solution. Whereas I suppose the politicians, their job is very different. They're having to deal with much broader and...
Well, but the law gets changed because of defects that affect individual cases. This happens all the time. A particular case highlights the defects.
My own view, again, maybe I'd be a useless politician, is that there is a desperate need here. And the politicians should change the law to deal with, what is a does appear to be a profound injustice.
Right. I mean, I noticed, for example, they're now getting to grips supposedly with the new children's law, which they've been talking about for a long time. They've got a proposal which is going to be debated at some point. I don't know who looked at it. Have you seen it? Has it come your way?
I think I've got more than enough to be looking at.
Yeah.
So no, I hope. You've had the inquiry here. The Independent Jersey Care Inquiry produced that very comprehensive report. They came back, the panel, and did a review, and they ticked some of the boxes and didn't tick other boxes. I think it's just incumbent on Jersey's politicians to implement.
Well, that's exactly the point that's going through my head. The politicians, because there's things in there, the children's law about corporate parent and the famous pledge, which nobody took any notice of at all, as far as I can make out. But it puts obligations on every state's member. Now, if there are defects arising, I mean, is there any state in the world where the politicians would be liable? They could be taken to court for failing and for doing these things?
But of course, if a case is brought, I don't know about Jersey, but let's say if we talk about the UK, if a case is brought against a minister, it's not against them personally, it's against what they represent, their department, their ministry.
But they make the decisions. They very often sign off a decision to do something, fail to do something, not to pay compensation.
I think it comes down to accountability, doesn't it? I think it's very important, but there is accountability, and I think there's a growing trend. I'm not necessarily talking about Jersey, so I'm just talking about my experience mainly of what happens in the UK. But you see, it's a sort of common theme that's not just confined to the UK. You see it elsewhere, where you've got decisions being made in silos. Professionals not talking to each other, information that's readily available not being accessed, and no one person or department or body actually being ultimately responsible. So I see things when something terrible has happened. I only see things when it's too late, a child's been injured or worse, killed. And you see the same issues time and time again.
Well, football ground tragedies, blocks of flats burning down. There was a little, not a celebration exactly, but Bloody Sunday. There's a room somewhere in Ireland with a room full of reports and files. And what's happened?
Well, dealing with what you asked me to talk about is that, you see all these reports after, some tragedy. But dealing with children, you see the same errors and the same patterns time and time again, which is what is described as a lack of professional curiosity. So, you see that term used quite a lot, where there is readily available information which had it been read, digested, a different decision would have been made, and maybe that child would have been saved. And
because we have to get you to the airport, I'm not going to let you talk much longer, but we're going to have to go.
Yeah.
But have you noticed, since the Great Inquiry, are things improving at all? From what you visit Jersey, you see it afresh, you deal with people. Are things changing for the better?
Well, certainly as regards what I'm here for today, and what I've been hearing, I'm concerned that a problem that was raised some years ago has not been addressed. Right. And maybe it will get addressed, and it ought to be addressed.
Right.
So it is concerning that people who live in Jersey have made complaints and brought those complaints to the attention of those who need to be made aware that there was a problem. That this has yet to be resolved.
Which department would that go to? Because obviously the Children's Commissioner is an independent.
Yeah,
She can't do it.
Nothing to do with the Children's
Ministry.
It's
Justice, courts.
Well, it's all, from what I see, it's all sort of interdepartmental.
Is it?
Yes.
Right.
So people who've been directly affected expressed their unhappiness and they've expected something to be done, and that something has yet to be done. Maybe it'll all come right. So, but we shall see. It ought to be put right because it just doesn't.
I mean, I'm not looking for a job
fair.
for you, but if there was some sort of those issues, whatever they might be, if you were invited to come on board and help, would you be up for it?
Yeah, I would, but that ain't going to happen. So that's a purely academic question with an academic answer.
Okay.
And now
You're going to take
I must bid you farewell.
Okay.
Until next time.
Thank you very much indeed.